This is the podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, where the world's voices converge, from ambassadors to analysts, from Houston to every corner of the globe. We go beyond the headlines, bringing you direct insights into diplomacy, global events, and the international forces shaping our future. Because understanding the world starts with listening to it.
I've never been introduced as a two-time Boston Marathon finisher. I like it. So thank you all for coming. Thanks, Ronan and Jahan, for helping to put this event together. And I especially want to thank all of you. I'm getting echo. Are you hearing it? No? Okay. So long as it's just me. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. About 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, as Ethan said, I studied Congress. And about 3 years ago, I decided that I didn't want to wake up every day and have to think about Congress. And so I started doing a pet project on the popes. And so for the last couple of years, I've been studying the popes, and I'm about 90% done with the manuscript on Pope Francis, which I'll share a little bit with you today about. To indicate, or to give you an indication of how I became interested in the popes is that I teach a class every other year in Rome, where I have the great pleasure of taking somewhere between 18 and 25 students from the University of Texas to Rome, where we study for 4 weeks in a class called The Politics of the Catholic Church. So we spend some time in the classroom, but our classroom is really all of Rome. So we get to experience some pretty incredible tours. We meet with people who are inside the church, people who cover the church, people who observe the church. And we've had some pretty incredible experiences, including a couple of years ago, a year and a half or so ago, we had the pleasure of getting tickets to a papal mass inside St. Peter's. This was the last time that Pope Francis said the Pentecost Mass, and so we were there for that. And then a year later, we were able to go. And on the Thursday before we arrived on Monday, there was a new pope in town. And so we were there for his inaugural mass. And so when I suggested to the students that we should go to the mass, and I said, maybe we should get up at like maybe 6 o'clock so we can be towards the front of the line. And they're like, for a papal inaugural mass, we're waking up at 5 o'clock. And so we were in line at 5 o'clock for the papal mass, for his inaugural mass. But as Ethan alluded to, I know this building a lot better than I know St. Peter's, right? So I've written 6 books, and I'll just go through them really quickly. They make wonderful Christmas presents. But one of the things that we know in studying political science, oops, it went too far, is that, right, so the St. Peter's looks an awful lot like the U.S. Capitol. And they even have similar structures, right? There's a person at the top. There's a bunch of supportive agencies. Normally, there's checks and balances more in the American system. But there's all sorts of people who are involved in the running of the U.S. government and the running of the Holy See or the Vatican. And as a social scientist, I believe if we know the structure and we know the individuals that inhabit the structure, then we should be able to make some predictions about what happens in both Congress and in the Vatican. And so what I'm doing in this project is I'm trying to use the tools of social science to try and gain some insight into papal decision-making, how the Vatican runs, and that's really what the purpose of the book is. To give you a brief outline of the talk today, I'll first talk a little bit about the Vatican as a global power, and then I will give you some insights from the book. And then finally, the last third, we will spend a little bit of time thinking about Leo. We're still very early in his pontificate, but I think there are some insights that we can already glean. So first, the Vatican as a global power. So I'm sure many people in this room have been to Rome and to the Vatican, and it literally is that tiny, right? When the church takes up about 1/8 of the property of the Vatican, you know you're dealing with, even though it's a big church, you're dealing with a really small piece of land. In fact, even when I show you all of Rome, it's a tiny little corner of Rome. And of course, Rome is just a tiny little part of Italy. And of course, Italy is just a tiny little part of the globe. So how is it that we could say that the Vatican is a global power? In a little bit of historical context here, we'll give some additional insight, right? So if we go back to Europe in the 1930s, the Prime Minister of France was the Prime Minister, Jahan, my battery is running low. Prime Minister of France is meeting with Joseph Stalin, and they're trying to come up with a strategy for how to combat Germany, which is becoming a bigger and bigger problem in Europe. And Pierre Laval says something about the Pope. And the Pope at the time is Pope Pius XI. Okay. Pope Pius XI. And Joseph Stalin is reputed to have said, the Pope, how many divisions has he got? Right, so when we talk about the Pope and the Vatican, we're talking about a really soft power. Of course, there is people, a military outfit of sorts in the Vatican, the Swiss Guards, but they number so few, and their primary responsibility is to protect the Pope. So they're not going to be a big player on the world stage. But yet, there are Catholics all over the globe. And so this map shows you the percentage of Catholics in each of the countries. If we look at the number of Catholics in the countries, you'll see that the spread is quite large. Right, so even including Russia and China, huge countries, but there are still a lot of Catholics. And what's true is that the Vatican has relationships with most countries on the globe. Right, there are a few exceptions. And to most of the countries which there are diplomatic relations, there is a papal nuncio that represents the Pope in the country. We can think of apostolic nuncios as something like ambassadors. So they are the Pope's ambassador, but they play another role. They're also instrumental in the organization of the church within those countries. And so they meet regularly with the bishops and the priests in those countries. And so you can think of the Pope as having spies, if you will, through churches all over the globe. And then the communication network works through the nuncios and ultimately gets back to Rome. And so the network is quite expansive. And the world leaders treat the Pope as a major world player. Right, so here is John the 23rd meeting with Charles de Gaulle, and we have Pope Paul VI, who is the first pope to ever address a UN General Assembly, to which each of his successors has also done. We have, of course, John Paul II meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev after the fall of the Soviet Union. We have Pope Benedict XVI meeting with Angela Merkel. And we have, of course, Pope Francis being the first pope ever to address a joint session of Congress. And even over the last couple of months, we've seen Pope Leo meet with an American delegation, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and J.D. Vance, the Vice President. And so on the world stage, the fellow people on the world stage are treating the Pope as a world leader. I think that the best kind of depiction I can show for you about how important the Pope is and how revered the Pope is, there was a meeting in Europe in 2024 where there was a group photo. And then the next day, the Pope shows up, and the number of world leaders that wanted to be in the photo with the Pope was a little bit more than the ones that wanted to be in the photo before the Pope had arrived. And on occasion, right, popes even are named Man of the Year, right? So if we go back to I think it's 63, right? John the 23rd is named the Man of the Year. In 1980, I can't remember the year and I can't see it up there. John Paul II is named Man of the Year. And of course, most recently, Pope Francis in 2013 was named Person of the Year. You'll notice that Time had gotten rid of, by that point, the gendered Man of the Year title. There's one other piece of evidence that I'm going to try to convince you of the importance of the Vatican on the world stage. You might have heard of Trump's Board of Peace. So these are the countries who've already accepted the invitation to be on the Board of Peace. These are the countries who've turned down the offer. And if you've been paying close attention to the news, Canada's invitation was rescinded. And these are the countries whose invitation has not yet been either accepted or denied. And you'll notice the second to last name on that list is the Vatican City, right? And so we're still waiting to see if the Pope is going to accept the invitation to be on the Board of Peace. The nice thing for the Pope is he doesn't have to pay the $1 billion to be on it. He's been given a waiver. Now I'll talk a little bit about Francis and whether or not he's an iconoclast. And so this is the book that I'm currently writing. And when Ronan and I were talking about what I would talk about tonight, I kept telling Ronan, I was like, I'm writing a book about Pope Francis. And he kept saying, but they want to hear about Pope Leo. And I said, but I'm writing a book about Pope Francis. And he said, but they want to hear about Pope Leo. So this is the compromise that we came to. So in my book on Pope Francis, there are three different kind of realms that I'm examining how different Pope Francis is from his predecessors. The first one of those are the policies. Does he talk about different sorts of things than previous popes have done? The second thing I'm looking at are the personnel. Like, does he name people who have different kind of backgrounds than his predecessors? And the third is, does he take different kind of pilgrimages? I can't help but be a professor. And so if I can make my job easier for the students, then I'll go with the alliteration of 3 Ps, because it's just easier for them to remember. So policies, personnel, and pilgrimages. So let's first start with policies. So every year, in the beginning of the year, the Pope gives an address to the diplomatic corps. It's usually in the first couple weeks of the year. The speech contains some boilerplate usually, right? So welcoming the people, hoping that they had a nice Christmas season, right? The beginning of this year, which is particularly meaningful for the Catholic Church, are coming together as symbolism all of its own. But if you dig down a little bit, you'll start seeing some really policy explicit statements from the Pope. So the growth of artificial intelligence raises broader concerns about intellectual property rights. So what I do in the speeches is I categorize each of the topics that he talks about into 21 major topic codes. And so this one is technology. He also says, I renew my appeal for a ceasefire in the release of Israeli hostages in Gaza. Of course, that's international affairs. Let us establish a global fund that can finally put an end to hunger. Of course, that is social welfare. Efforts need to be made to create dignified working conditions. Of course, that is labor. And then there is the horrific slavery of drug addiction. Of course, drug addiction would fall under the category of health. And finally, the last one, I reiterate my call for the death penalty to be eliminated. And we can easily put that category in crime, which also includes punishment. And so, if we look at his speech in 2025, the vast majority of it was on international relations. There was a little bit on civil rights and defense and trade, right? A little bit more on immigration. And if we look at the previous papal addresses to the diplomatic corps, we can fill out the entire map. And we see how Pope Francis looks a little bit different. Now, right, this is the year-by-year variation. Now I'm just going to kind of merge their papacies, right? So collecting all of Francis's speeches, that's what the number of statements that he made on international affairs and so on and so forth. But I want to look at proportions, right? John the 23rd gives really short speeches, and so I want to see what percentage of his speech is dedicated to international affairs. And again, right, it's hard to take all of that into consideration as you're trying to develop a pattern that might exist. And so what I do is I look at the transitions, right? So first we look at the transition from John the 23rd to Paul VI, and we see that he spends 3% less time talking about international affairs, 2% more time talking about civil rights, 2% more time talking about defense, 4% more time talking about law and crime. Immigration is almost flat, social welfare less, and then environment just a little bit less. And then we can see the transition then from, so an average absolute difference of 0.02. So not much difference. And then we can see the transition from Paul VI to John Paul II, right? Those are the gray-blue bars. And we see again, right, reading from a pretty similar script. And then, of course, John Paul to Benedict. And we see, again, not much variation. But finally, if we go from Benedict to Francis, we see that he spends a whole lot less time talking about international affairs and a whole lot more time talking about immigration, such that the difference between Francis's speeches and his predecessors is twice as great, right? So he's talking about much different topics than his predecessors. So I would say that, right, he in fact is highlighting different issues, although what he's saying about immigration, all of his predecessors would have agreed with. And what he's saying about international relations, all of his predecessors would have agreed with. It's just that he's focusing more on immigration and refugees in some of those issues, which hadn't been considered by some of his predecessors. So now let's think a little bit about Francis's personnel. So in the personnel chapter, I spent a lot of time talking about the College of Cardinals, right? So if we look at the conclave that elected Francis in 2013, we see that 11 came from Asia and Oceania, 60 came from Europe, 19 from Latin America, 14 from the United States, and 11 from Africa. By the time we get to the end of Francis's papacy, we see that some of those categories have changed a great deal, such as Asia and Oceania and Africa. Some of those decrease, right? So Europe goes down, Latin America goes up just a little bit, and the United States and Canada stays completely flat. So if we look at the nationality of the cardinals that each of the popes named from, those are the top 10, right? So Italy, France, Spain, US, and so on and so forth. If we look at the cardinals that Francis names, only 19% of them are from Italy. Even a much smaller percentage are from France. The only time that there's a number is when it's greater than 5%. So he named 6% from Spain, and then 55% of them. Over half of the cardinals that he names comes from outside of the top 10 nations that have given us cardinals in the church. And we can see how different that is from his predecessors, right? If we go all the way back to the middle part of the 19th century, Pope Pius IX is naming 59% from Italy. We see some variations, right? So John Paul is naming 46 from outside the top 10, but still not close to the 55 of Francis. If we look at the correlations that each of, and I know there's lots of numbers here, and I apologize for that. I can't help but be a social scientist. The correlations of the countries to which the Pope names cardinals from, we see that, right, there's a correlation of 0.92. The highest you can get is 1. And the lowest is 0. And then if it's a perfect negative correlation, it would be -1. And that's how he is associated with his predecessors, giving us an average correlation of 0.9. And we can see again how different that is from the predecessors by filling out the rest of the graph. So the only one that's even close is Pope Pius XII in the middle part of the 20th century. But the rest of them have typically a much higher correlation. In the chapter, I spend an equal amount of time talking about prefects. So the United States government has a Secretary of Agriculture. In the Vatican, there is a prefect for Catholic education. In the United States, there's an Attorney General. In the Vatican, there's a prefect for the doctrine of the faith, right? So prefects are the top position in the Vatican bureaucracy. And the one big, huge change that Pope Francis made with prefects was that he named a woman to head a Vatican bureaucracy. It's the first time in Catholic Church history that he names a woman. And she's the prefect for the Dicastery of Institute of Consecrated Life and Societies of Apostolic Life, or the religious, right? So the dicastery that's responsible for nuns and brothers And she is the head of it, and she continues to be the head of it. So even under Pope Leo, she has maintained her position. The last part of the book is on pilgrimages. Where do popes go? In 1829, this is what Italy looks like. So we have the Papal States, which is actually territory governed by the popes. And shortly after that, 1861, Italy starts unifying. And when Italy gets unified, the Papal States go away. And so Pope Pius IX, who is the Pope during this time period, talks about being a prisoner of the Vatican. So when all of his territory goes away, he stays in the Vatican. And so does his predecessor, and so does his predecessor, and so does his predecessor. So it's not until we get to 1929 and the signing of the Lateran Pact where the Vatican city-state is created, and the Pope once again feels comfortable leaving the confines of the Vatican. The first Pope to leave the peninsula of Italy after they become a prisoner of the Vatican is Pope Paul VI, when he goes to the Holy Land, where he meets the Patriarch of Constantinople on the Mount of Olives. And he does this in 1964. It's the first time that the two leaders of the ancient Christian churches meet since the Great Schism of 1054. And here's, right, Ronan didn't tell you that you're going to have a pop quiz. So your pop quiz is, so who was the most recent pope before Paul VI that leaves the Italian peninsula? And you might know this even if you don't know a whole lot about Catholic history. This is a world event. And as soon as I say it, you're going to say, of course. What? Not, so this is before, right? So before Paul VI. Yeah. So it's when the Pope leaves Rome to go to Paris to crown Napoleon, right? So that's the most recent time in 1804. And of course, right, like the crowning by the Pope doesn't happen, right? Because Napoleon crowns himself. So where do popes go? So these are the countries that have seen the popes the most. Right, so Francis has been to France 3 times. He's been to Poland, United States, Mexico, Switzerland, and Brazil once, and then Portugal he went to twice. And the rest of the popes, the traveling popes, if you will, that's where they go. And these are actual trips. And then the next chart looks at the number of days that they spend in each of those countries. So, right, John Paul II is 65 days in Poland. And so again, we're going to look at the correlations of the countries that they go to and how similar they are across popes. And so Francis's correlation is pretty low with Paul and with Benedict. It's a little bit higher with John Paul. So his average correlation is 0.2, which is a pretty weak correlation. And then when we fill out the chart, we see that John Paul and Benedict, as usual, are reading from the same script. They're going to the same places. But Paul is the outlier here, right? So Paul went to, he went to Australia and the Philippines and to South America. He didn't spend a whole lot of time in Europe. And Benedict spent a whole lot of time in Europe. And so just a difference in priorities. And then these are the correlations when we look at actual days. And we see that there's not much difference. Again, Francis is the second lowest, only behind Paul VI. So when I'm done with this chapter, I'm like, I don't see anything unique about Francis. And so I need to dig a little bit deeper. And I say, who are they meeting with? And so I look at each of the trips that they make to the United States to find out who their meetings are with. And Paul VI lands in New York in the morning and leaves New York at night. Right? He doesn't even spend the night on American soil. He goes to the World's Fair, and this is a good story. He goes to the World Fair to visit a statue that had never left where it was placed when it was placed there. And the statue is one of the most famous statues in the world. Any guesses? The Pietà. Right? So he goes to the World's Fair. Right? New York had the Pietà. And it's a good thing they did because before it leaves St. Peter's, they do an exact replica of the Pietà. And you'll remember that, oh gosh, this is probably 15 years ago or so now, a crazy person takes a hammer to the Pietà, and it's only because they had that exact replica that they could restore the Pietà to its exact original condition. And the only reason they had that exact replica is because Cardinal Spellman convinced Paul VI to lend the Pietà to New York for the World's Fair. Gosh. Right, so how do they spend their days abroad? So I don't look at Paul VI, right? He's in town long enough to go to the World's Fair, to give a national speech at the UN, and to meet with LBJ, during which LBJ gives him a bust of himself, because that's what Paul VI wanted, was a bust of LBJ. I love Texans. So how did they otherwise spend their time abroad, right? So this is Paul meeting with LBJ. So when John Paul II comes to the United States, and he comes right somewhere between 5 and 7, do we count a layover in Alaska where they're refueling when he's on his way to Asia? Right, you're shaking your head no, except that he has a mass, he's meeting with the governor, right? Like, and a president one time even flew to meet him there. And so, right, John Paul, when he comes to the United States, he loved meeting with Catholic groups. So he would meet with the Knights of Columbus. He would meet with Polish Catholics in any city that he went to. He would meet with indigenous Catholics. Like, he loved the Catholic group. And when Benedict comes to the United States, he is mostly meeting with the hierarchy of the church. So he's meeting with the bishops. And of course, each of them are also meeting with the presidents. And then when Benedict comes, he of course meets with Barack Obama, but he's also meeting with, I think I have a photo here, right? So here is John Paul meeting with the Catholic groups, and then Benedict meeting with the Catholic Church hierarchy. Benedict, in every city that he went to, he either went to a prison, he went to a detention center, or he went to a jail, or to a homeless center. So now let's. So in thinking about Francis and whether or not he's an iconoclast, at the end of the book, I say, yes, he is an iconoclast. And I'm still working on the conclusion a little bit. And the reason I consider him an iconoclast is we have to consider everything that happened during this first week. Remember when he shows up on the loggia and he's not wearing the papal vestments, he's paying his hotel bill, he's carrying his own suitcase, he's riding around a small little car, he's taking the bus back from the Sistine Chapel with the rest of the cardinals instead of in his limousine. He emphasizes different issues. He spent much more time on homelessness, on immigration, and social welfare problems like that. He created peculiar paths to becoming a cardinal, and I wish I could tell you the stories. I'm just going to encourage you to read the book to find out how the bishop in San Diego becomes a cardinal, even while the archbishop in Los Angeles isn't a cardinal. He named a woman to be a prefect, breaking the glass ceiling, if you will, or the stained glass ceiling of the church. And he met with different people on his trips. But in the conclusion of the book, I say that all the modern popes are iconoclastic. Because of how long they serve, the changes in the world, the demands placed on them, and the skill set that they bring to the office, they are each redefining the office in their own image, right? So John the 23rd was supposed to be a transition pope 5 years. Within being pope of a couple of months, he calls the Second Vatican Council, right? The Second Vatican Council is the most revolutionary thing that happened to the church in 2 millennia. We have Paul VI, the first pope ever to get on a plane, goes to the far stretches of the globe, expands the College of Cardinals in a way that Francis takes the baton and continues to expand the College of Cardinals in directions that they hadn't been before. And then, of course, John Paul II, totally redefined. During John Paul's II papacy, the Pope becomes a global superstar, right? He raptures the attention of the world. And so you look at those and you're like, but that's not all the popes that have been popes since John the 23rd. There are 2 other popes, and even in their own way, they changed the papacy, right? So John Paul I is the first pope ever to adopt 2 names. He is also the first pope that doesn't get crowned with the papal tiara, right? So he made that decision. And he becomes iconoclastic because his papacy only lasts 33 days, right? So it's something that we can't imagine. And then the other one, perhaps who had the most ordinary papacy of the modern era, is Benedict XVI, until the very last second that he spends sitting in the chair of St. Peter, right? By resigning the papacy, he radically transforms how it is that we think about the Pope, and how popes can ultimately then end their papacies. And so in the end, I argue that indeed all of them are iconoclastic. So now let's talk about Leo, right? So he's been Pope not even for a year yet. In the average of the popes in the era that we're talking about is about 14 years, right? So we're not even a tenth of the way through his papacy. But I think that we can glean some insights. But I'm going to start first with how he becomes Pope. So, of course, right, Francis dies, and people start predicting who's going to be the next Pope. And so they tell us it's most certainly going to be one of these 4 people. And if it's not those 4, then it's certainly going to be one of these 6 people. And if it's not one of those 6, then it's certainly going to be one of these 9. And so finally, right, some of you might recognize that he is one of the 9. And right, here's a list of 12, and then there's a list of 20. And then there's these betting markets where you can predict who's going to be the next Pope. So Pietro Parolin starts off pretty high. By the time they get into the Sistine Chapel, he's just above Tagle, who is twice as much betting than Zuppi. And there are all sorts of betting markets, right? Like, it's just incredible. I mean, I guess if you can bet on the third play of the Super Bowl being a pass instead of a run, I guess we shouldn't be surprised that you can also bet on who's going to become Pope. All right, so here's my kind of brief understanding of what ultimately happens when they get to the conclave. So those are the 9, let's say, that we should think about. The first thing that we can get rid of are the people who are towards 80 or just over 80. And so that gets rid of the archbishop in Vienna, and it gets rid of the guy that had the job that Prevost had before he became Pope, right? So the prefect for the bishops, Ouellette, who's from Canada. The next thing that happens is that Tagle had almost no support. And so people recognized that his chances of becoming Pope weren't that high. And the other 3, there were 3 kind of Francis picks in the mix. And none of the 3 had support. And in fact, it looked like the support among the Francis folks were going to the archbishop in Marseille. And so we can get rid of a couple more names because the Francis cardinals weren't getting much support. So the next thing that happens is that the Africans weren't getting much support even from Africa. So their vote totals in the first couple of ballots were really low, and so they became non-players. And so we can get rid of Cardinal Sarah. So then what happens, right? We're down with 3. And what happens is that Erdo and Parolin, so Erdo is the upper left and Parolin right next to Prevost. So they were supposed to be the conservative choice and the liberal choice. And in the first ballot, right, again, we don't know these numbers, but it's been suggested that they're in the 40s or so. And in the second ballot, their numbers don't grow. And so the cardinals start saying, it's not going to be one of those 2 guys. And so who's left but the guy in the middle? And so they start thinking about compromise candidates. And so political scientists have taken all of the cardinals, looked at all of their public statements, and decided what their ideology was, and then ranks them from liberal to conservative, just based on their public pronouncements about various issues. And you can see that Prevost is right there in the middle. So he becomes a very viable compromise candidate. And in the end, and this has just been leaked over the last week or so, apparently he had 110 votes in the last vote that elected him. And there were only about 133 people. So that meant that he had more votes in a conclave than any of his previous predecessors. And so this is how Prevost, who is the prefect for the dicastery of bishops, ultimately becomes Pope Leo. And so there is one set of political scientists that predicted that Prevost would become the Pope. And what they did is they did a network analysis. So they looked at administrative relationships in the church. So are they serving on the same boards of the prefects with each other? They looked at spiritual relationships. Do they come from the same order? Do they come from the same kind of movement within inside the church? And then informal relationships, mentorships, friendships, like where there are some connections. And you'll see that Prevost, there in red, has the most connections. And so before they went into conclave, they published this paper that said that Prevost was going to be the next pope, just based on network analysis. So there are a couple of expressions that I love in the Catholic Church. There's two that I'm going to introduce you to today. The first one is, he who goes into a conclave as a pope comes out a cardinal. So that means that the people that everyone thinks is going to be the next pope usually doesn't win. And in this case, I think we can talk about Paroline and Tagle. I think those were the two that people thought had the most greatest likelihood of becoming pope. So let's think a little bit about Pope Leo XIV and see if we can tea leaf read a little bit to see what kind of pope he's going to be. So the first thing that we notice is his country is different than any of the previous popes, right? So he's from the United States, grew up in Chicago. By the time he's elected pope, he really comes from Vatican City, right, as prefect for the dicastery of bishops, but he had spent a lot of his adult life in Peru. In each, right, Peru and the United States, of course, hadn't had a pope before, and so he's going to be iconoclastic, at least from where he came. His name, right? He chose the name Leo, and they say that he chose the name Leo because of Pope Leo XIII, right? So he is pope at the very end of the 19th century, and he's the pope that really unifies the Catholic Church with the worker, right? So the end of the 19th century, we're dealing with the Industrial Revolution, and he puts the church on the side of the oppressed working in those factories. But I have a separate theory. I've not heard anyone suggest this, but I think it's going to give us some insight into how we should think about the dynamics of two different people named Francis and Leo. So I think that it could also be, he could have also chosen the name because of Brother Leo. So Brother Leo is the person that's really responsible for the existence of the Franciscans today. So he was St. Francis's chief friend and collaborator in the establishment of the rule of St. Francis. And I think that I don't know how much you all know about St. Francis. The guy was a little weird, right? Like a pious and wonderful man. He talked to birds, right? He stripped himself of all of his clothes and left it on the road and just expected God to provide, right? That's the kind of mindset that Francis had. And Leo's the guy kind of behind him, picking his clothes up and giving him a cloak and saying, like, don't do that so much. And I think the same analogy could apply to Francis, Pope Francis. I think Pope Francis is a wonderful, wonderful human being. I'm not sure he knew how to run an organization. But I think that Leo is gonna make sure that the Francis legacy stays institutionalized within the church. And so if I could ask Pope Leo one question, this is the question: if in the back of his mind was he thinking a little bit about Brother Leo? So the vestments are back, right? So this is the way that we learn about Pope Leo, which is much different than how we learned about Pope Francis. Pope Leo looked much more like Pope Benedict and John Paul II even before that. And when I say the vestments are back, I not only mean that, but kind of the traditional trappings of the Pope are back, right? So we're going to see a little bit of a Leo spin to them, but right, we should expect some of this to come back. So the shoes, right? So these are Pope Francis's shoes. Those were Benedict's shoes. So what do you think, Leo? What kind of shoes is Leo wearing? Red slippers? No. So he's wearing, I mean, not quite the black shoes of Francis, but right, stylish black shoes. And there's a close-up of them. Right, so here's the apostolic apartment. So remember that Francis lived in Santa Marta, the guest house. Pope Leo is moving back into the apostolic palace, but not the Pope's apartments. Right, they've renovated the floor above, which are going to be much simpler. It's been suggested that he might live in community with some of the Augustinians in Rome, just as he was before he was named Pope. And so again, he's becoming a more traditional, right? The vestments are back, but not quite the same that they were before. Castel Gandolfo. Pope Francis hated going to Castel Gandolfo. I think he went 3 times. Some of his predecessors would spend entire summers there. Right? Castel Gandolfo is a far more hospitable place to be than Rome during the summer. So again, Pope Leo is the trappings of the office, so he's going there on Tuesdays. So Tuesdays is the traditional day off of the Pope. Apparently, if you're Pope, you can't take Sunday off because you got a job to do. So he takes Tuesdays off. So he'll leave Rome on Monday night. He'll spend Tuesday in Castel Gandolfo, and sometimes he'll come back Wednesday morning, sometimes Tuesday night. Pope Leo likes meetings. People call him a great listener. So here he is after a meeting with Cardinal Burke. We can think of Cardinal Burke as being the most conservative American cardinal. The person to whom Pope Francis fired from a position, gave him an honorary position to help him save face, and then fired him from that. Right? So that was how Pope Francis was going to deal with Cardinal Burke. So Pope Leo is meeting with him. But he's not only meeting with Cardinal Burke, the most conservative, right, the most conservative face in American Catholicism. He's also meeting, so Cardinal Burke is famous for the Latin Mass. Pope Leo allows him to say the Latin Mass in St. Peter's, something that Francis would never have allowed. He's also meeting with Father Martin, who is a minister to the LGBT community in San Francisco. And he's also posing with him. And so, right, like I'm a tea leaf reader, right? So I want to see, so where is Pope Leo's smile greater? This guy holds his cards really close to his chest. Who knows which meeting he enjoyed more? So how is Pope Leo doing? So first, he wasn't named Times Man of the Year, but he was named one of the most influential people in 2025. More than that, Vogue named him one of the best dressed of 2025. And that's the picture that they include, but they also include some other pictures of Pope Leo in his various attire. So among Americans, in a poll conducted at the end of 2025, they asked, like, how do you feel about this person? And so Elon Musk had a negative approval rating by 28%, right? So that meant that there were 28% greater people who disapproved of him than approved of him. And here are various other kind of politicians, right? Netanyahu, Rubio, Trump, Newsom, Vance, Biden, Macron, Zelensky, right? Positive 18 among the American public. And then Pope Leo, 46. Right, so he's pretty popular in the United States. Well, let's go global. So how does he fare among world leaders, among a global survey, right? So again, he's the most popular, 24%. So the second expression that I really love in the Catholic Church, right? So after he who goes into a conclave as a pope comes out a cardinal, is after a fat pope, a skinny pope. And I mean no disrespect with Pope Francis, but can we all just agree that he was not a slender man? So if he's the fat pope, then we have to think about Pope Leo as being a skinny pope. And here I don't mean, right, size-wise, but in what ways is Pope Leo also fat? So in what ways is he going to be an awful lot like Francis? And so here are some of the ways that I think. And I just love this picture of the two of them. So because of his job in the Vatican, Cardinal Prevost, he met with Francis every Saturday. And they would talk about who should be bishops all over the globe. And so I'm sure this was taken perhaps in one of those meetings. The first way in which I think they're really similar is they're both very humble people. Humility, I think, and people would say that was true about them before they were pope and even during their papacies. He's very pastoral, right? I think that Pope Francis gave us this image that the person leading the flock needed to smell like the flock. And I expect that we'll get the same sorts of messages from Pope Leo. I think they share similar beliefs. I think that Pope Leo is reading very much from the same script when he's talking to the diplomatic corps as as Francis was. I think he cares about the poor, the refugees, and the immigrants. I think that he wants to put the church on their side. Todos, 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 everyone, everyone, everyone. The church is all-inclusive. The church should not be in the business of excluding anyone. We should take up the bandaged and the wounded, and we should try and make them whole. Both of them think that, I think. He believes in synodality, right? So Pope Francis had this idea that you have lots of meetings and you get together and you try to form some type of consensus before you move forward. And I think that Leo, even in his first address when he was announced Pope, talked about synodality. So how is Pope Leo skinny? So how is he going to be different than Pope Francis? Here's just some of the ways that I expect. So he's Franciscan in tone, but structurally sharp. So I think that he's not going to say things off the cuff. He's never going to make big headlines with the speeches that he makes. He's never going to have the big press conference on the plane that people back at the Vatican are going to be pulling their hair out because of. He's going to stay in his lane in a way that Francis never did. I think he's more reserved, right? Like, I don't think that he's going to be this charismatic person that's going to be mixing it up with the crowds. I think when he wears the Yankees hat or he gives us that little bit of a smirk, I think we read a lot into that. But I don't think he's ever going to be kind of Francis or even John Paul II in that regard. He's a great listener. And I think Francis was a great talker. And so I think that's how they're going to be different. Todos, todos, todos. And here, I had it on the previous slide. Here, I mean that he's going to talk to every single cardinal. He's not going to refuse to meet with people who are in the church. He thinks it's his job to bring everyone along, right? Francis didn't have any use for some people and wouldn't grant their meetings. I think he truly believes in synodality. I think that Francis introduced the topic, but I think that Leo is going to carry it forward in a way that Francis really couldn't because of his charismatic personality style and leadership style. He's an insider, right? So he was the person who was responsible for the naming of bishops before he becomes the Pope. Pope Francis was from Buenos Aires and had never served a stint in Vatican City. He's a careful speaker, right? He's never going to speak out of turn. And I think that everyone in the Vatican is going to know what he says before he even says it. And I think in conclusion, Midwestern nice is going to replace Argentinian sass. So I think we should think of him as, Chicago is really close to Minnesota, so I just say Midwestern nice. And that's my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. That was excellent. I think it's quite evident. You guys can see why you were voted Professor of the Year, not at a very small school, but one of the largest schools in the country with hundreds of professors at UT. That was excellent. I think it's nice, especially you guys are regulars, we're covering geopolitics, what's going wrong in Russia, China, Iran. It's nice to focus us up a little more upbeat. So thank you for that. I'd also like to recognize, I think, is Kate Hawk here? Yes. A great friend of the council for many years. Herself, Houston Seminar, who also do excellent events. I recommend you guys checking them out. I first met Sean at one of Kate's events with Houston Seminar. I thought, hey, this is an excellent, fascinating topic. And in particular, I would be remiss not to recognize my former president when I was at the University of St. Thomas, who is now Archbishop Emeritus Miller, Archbishop Emeritus of Vancouver, who between the University of St. Thomas and before he was Archbishop of Vancouver, actually served in the Secretariat of State, basically the foreign ministry of the Vatican, something we'll get into here in a little bit. So in a lot of ways, I'm throwing everybody's questions at you if they have questions about the foreign policy of the Vatican. But I would just say one thing I really appreciate about your talk is until these last two popes, every pope was from Europe. The huge number from Italy. Maybe you get someone from Poland or Germany or France. We have not yet had a pope from Africa or from Asia. These are the first two from the Americas. Last summer, my wife is Stacy Muratta, a good Italian American. We were in Rome with our kids. It was just coincidental, but last year was a Jubilee year. Any of you are Catholic? I'm Catholic myself. And it was just a fascinating energy to be in Rome for the kind of ultimate celebration. On the outskirts of Rome, they have a mass for roughly about 1 million people. It has to be in a huge park there. And it's primarily geared towards the Catholic youth, the next generation. But there were groups of Catholic youths going all around Rome, singing songs, playing music from Peru, from the Philippines, from Africa, from the United States. It really gives you an idea of the real future or current state of the Catholic Church is not really European, it's the rest of the world. But I liked your fat, skinny analogy with Francis and Leo. Another thing they share in common that he would be fat like Francis is that though he is American, he is from the United States, he's from Southside Chicago, White Sox fan. Once he was ordained, both him and Francis spent the majority of their professional career serving in Latin America. Obviously, it's very different to being in Italy or Germany or Poland. Can you talk about how maybe that shaped each of them? And really, in a lot of ways, maybe their idea of serving the poor, of thinking beyond kind of, the first world and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So, of course, Francis is born and bred in Buenos Aires, right? So he is of that community. Pope Leo grew up in a Midwestern middle-class family, but then he becomes a missionary and so goes to Peru. And so he deals with many different problems that he was never confronted with in the Midwest. He is a leader of the church, the local church in Peru, and he smells like the flock. And so that can't help but have had an impact on him. And after he does that for a few years, right, then he becomes the superior general of the Augustinians, and he serves 2 terms as that. And so for 10 years, he's traveling all around the globe and meeting with all the Augustinians around the globe. And again, I think that's very much kind of the worldview, and he recognizes that the problems of the United States are not equal to the problems of the world, and there are far different other problems out there that need to be addressed. And it's reported that when Francis was named Pope, then at that point, Father Prevost said, I guess I don't ever have to go to Rome, because they had some conflicts because they're both in South America. I mean, they're not big conflicts. And I think over the course of Francis's papacy, he wanted people who had the kind of experiences like Leo. One of the things that I really like about the Catholic Church, and when you study these people, and in fact, it's part why we have John Paul I, right? So he names himself John Paul I because he was named a bishop by John, and he was named a cardinal by Paul. And so he's honoring both of his predecessors. And if we look at, right, Benedict was named a cardinal by Paul, but brought to Rome by John Paul. And so I like how the success of the people that rise in the church is experienced under different papacies. But with Leo, we don't have that, right? So when Francis becomes Pope, he's a priest, right? And it's only under the Francis papacy that he grows to the upper echelons of the church. And I think it's because Francis, in some ways, really appreciated the background that he had, and really thought that in the naming of the bishops around the globe, that there needed to be someone with that mindset of naming people who are very pastoral rather than people who are great theologians of the church.
And if you all have questions, my colleagues will collect them here. I just want to ask 2 things to kind of bring it. We are the World Affairs Council. Obviously, historically, you go back hundreds of years, the popes in some ways were more powerful than many of the kings or even the emperors of their day. But even still have a significant degree of global influence beyond kind of what people might think of. We might, if any of us are old enough to remember John Paul II, obviously incredibly arduous and consistent anti-communist stance. But to bring it to Francis and Leo, I was thinking, actually, I was in contact with Ben Rhodes. You might remember, he was Obama's chief speechwriter, deputy national security advisor. We're probably going to host him end of May or in June. One of the things his book was he discussed how he was on the inside of opening relations with Cuba. And he told me and said the Vatican was basically invaluable. Without them, they could not have done what they do. They're go-between. Could you talk about, say, Francis and maybe the Vatican in general, in terms of maybe the quiet side of diplomacy and negotiations that we don't always think of, but it's going to be very important?
No, that's right. And so, right, what we have is, right, Francis is going to be much more cued to the problems in Cuba than a European-based cardinal would have been. And so I think that he recognized that Cuba was not in a good place. And a lot of that had to do with the American embargo that we have against Cuba. And so I think that he felt badly for the Cuban people, and he thought that maybe he could do something. And so he calls the Archbishop of Havana to Rome, writes letters to both Raul Castro and to Barack Obama, and has the Archbishop deliver both of those letters. And I think that did a lot in starting to establish at least a communication network between the Obama administration and the Castro regime in Cuba. And let's remember, right, I think it's true that Francis only ever comes to the United States once, right? Like he certainly does as Pope, he only comes once. I don't think he ever came, even when he was a cardinal or, right, he comes once. And before he comes to the United States, where does he go first? Cuba, right? So he flies from Rome to Cuba, spends 3 days in Cuba, and then comes to the United States. And I think that was very purposeful in kind of linking, right, his foreign policy objectives through his one and only trip to the United States.
And before I turn to the audience questions here, it's something, sadly, because it's been long enough durations for both conflicts, Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the full-scale invasion 2022, the Ukraine war, and Gaza after October 7th. Behind the scenes, Francis, I presume, was working. Leo, incredibly difficult task on either side. What do you think's the role of the Vatican in terms of those two kind of potential peace negotiations?
No, that's interesting, right? Like, let's first think a little bit about Francis and the Russia's invasion into Ukraine. I think this is one of the ways in which we saw Francis operating outside of the Vatican network. He stumbled for a couple of months after the invasion, right? He uses some rhetoric that makes him less able to be a peacemaker in that regime. At one point, he calls the Russian patriarch Putin's altar boy, right? It's hard to dial that back. And this is, right, Francis making headlines, right, in a way that Leo's never going to make those kinds of headlines. And right, I talked about Trump's Board of Peace, and if right, I didn't have the slide up there nearly long enough, but the countries that are mostly accepting the invitation are from the Gulf states, right, and some countries that we wouldn't expect. That the folks who have declined the invitation are most of the major European countries, and they make the argument that by joining, they're in some way making the job of the UN more difficult, right? So Trump's Board of Peace is becoming a separate organization, not going through the UN. And so you look at the Vatican, and right, they still haven't made up their mind. And I think with that, you get the very realist perspective of Vatican foreign policy. So, right, it would be easy for them to be on the side of Spain and France and England and say, no, we're not going to have anything to do with that. Except that because of Francis's involvement in Gaza, they know better perhaps than anyone else in Europe the suffering of the Gazans. And so I think that Pope Leo right now is thinking, if there's a group of world leaders sitting around trying to talk about how to rehabilitate Gaza, the conversation is going to be far better if the Pope is at that table than if the Pope is not at that table. And so, right, the realism of Vatican foreign policy, right, is like, all right, but I don't want to undermine the UN. I don't want to disappoint my European partners, but there's real suffering in Gaza. And if the Pope is at that table, I feel better about the situation that could emerge from Gaza than if the Pope isn't at that table and it's just a bunch of sheikhs from the Middle East.
Two good questions about kind of, I suppose, the development of Leo, and I suppose what might come from it. Father John Morphin asks, do you expect how do you expect Leo's Augustinian background to influence his decisions? And then one of our great and favorite teachers, Eric Tanner, asks, why do you think Francis chose cardinals from so many varied nations, and do you think Leo will do something similar?
Yeah. So first, his Augustinian upbringing. What we know about Augustinians, they like to live in community, and we may see that, right? Like the Vatican has not told us who's going to live in the attic of the apostolic apartment, but it could be that he's Augustinian. But they're also a very consensus-driven order, and so I think that the divisions in the church are going to constrain Leo in a much greater way than they would have Francis. If Francis had some people behind him, I think he is willing to press the envelope. I don't think Francis went nearly as far as he wished he could have, But he knew that if he took that extra step, there would be fewer and fewer people behind him. And at some point, he's just going to be a lonely guy taking a walk rather than the leader of 1.4 billion Catholics around the globe. And so I think that Leo is going to be much more consensus driven. He's going to wait. We're going to have lots of conversations inside the church. And I think Leo hopes that through those conversations, a greater consensus might emerge. And the second question was about naming cardinals, right? The problem with coming after Francis is there aren't many countries left. So where do you go? I mean, we've got Mongolia covered now. We have Sweden. We have, and so I think that what you're going to see with Leo is a return to some of the traditional paths. Right now, in the Catholic Church, there is not a cardinal, right? The Archbishop in Paris, the Archbishop in Los Angeles, the Archbishop in Milan, the Archbishop in Sicily, right? I can't remember all of. None of them are cardinals, right? These are the biggest archdioceses in the world. So I think his first consistory, the first time we get the announcement of 18 new cardinals, I think it's going to be backfilling a lot of those major archdioceses that aren't cardinals. And he also has to promote the guy that took his job, because he's not a cardinal either. And in order to run, unless if you're a woman, in order to run the head of the bureaucracy, you have to be made a cardinal. And so, right, I think you'll see some Vatican appointments and then lots of archbishops from traditional regions. And then maybe in his second or third, he'll start looking, right? Vietnam, I think, is ripe for a cardinal. And some, right, there are some countries out there that don't have a cardinal yet.
And some people put a name on their card, others don't. So it's probably fine if they don't. There's not a name on these next ones, but related to what you just discussed, can you discuss the role of women in the Catholic Church under Leo? You discussed earlier the first female prefect. Yeah. Where do you expect him to go? Do you think there's any chance of perhaps an opening up to the possibilities of female priests? What do you think?
It's interesting because there is a woman that's head of a prefect. In that same dicastery, there's what's called a pro-prefect, who's a cardinal who can do any of the ecclesiastical jobs that a prefect normally would do. And that's a really awkward relationship because you have a nun who's making all the decisions, except, right, if there's ever a point at which there has to be the host consecrated for Mass, right, then the pro-prefect kind of steps in and plays that ceremonial ecclesiastical role. So people heading into conclave said, this is one of the easy jobs that Leo can fix and wrap up and make clean again. But he's been Pope for a year, and she's still the prefect. And now the number 2 at that dicastery is also a woman. And it wasn't under Francis. And so I think that he is going to press the envelope in a very Leo kind of way, of trying to include more women. But it's a debate that a lot of people in the church don't yet want to have. But I think that Leo named certainly lots of cardinals that are more willing to engage in that debate. Leo will continue to do that. And perhaps in 300 years, we will have a debate inside the church about women.
A question here, just because, yeah, a lot of times people hear the terms, they don't know how they're applied. But when news commentators discuss conservative versus liberal leanings of popes, are they referring to their political opinions or their interpretation of church doctrine? I mean, obviously it could vary, but how would you say?
Yeah, I mean, so it's both. I think that we want to think a little, right? So instead of conservative and liberal, I think we should think about traditional and less traditional. So I think that when we talk about progressives, I think that we start thinking a little bit more, liberals, we start thinking about a little bit more about the social gospel, right? Making sure that people without roofs have roofs, people without food have food, people without clothes have clothes. And I think when we start thinking about conservatives, we think about being theologically pure, right? So it means something to be Catholic. And if you don't have those beliefs of what it means to be Catholic, then there are lots of other religions out there that you might find yourself being more comfortable. And I expect Leo to be every bit where Francis was, is that everyone's welcome. We'll take you and we'll try to make you whole. And what making you whole isn't, right, entirely defined at this point.
Just a last audience question. Vincent asked a good question. It's something you referenced earlier in your presentation. How do you see Pope Leo addressing concerns around AI?
Yeah, and so we think this is the reason for Leo the 13th, right? Leo the 14th. So Leo the 13th, right? The Pope, who is right, unites the worker with the social gospel. He's a complicated Pope, right? So he does that, but he also was known for having people kiss his feet before he would meet with them, right? Believed in the hierarchy and where he was in that hierarchy. And so I think Leo kind of put all of those other things aside and said, but the next great industrial revolution is going to come about because of AI. And so I think he wants to make sure that the development of AI is done where the human remains central to its development. And I think that if he could write his own kind of what his papacy is about, I think he would say it's making sure that the human isn't lost in this AI revolution that we're about to experience.
And just kind of last question. You mentioned we're not quite a year into Leo. You can make all the predictions you want. Obviously, all the betting houses were wrong. And it's hard to definitively know. He definitely holds his cards much closer than Francis or Benedict, I would say, probably. And ideologically, maybe in between the two of them. What's something you're keeping an eye on with regards to the next 6 months or year in terms of this will be an indication of where he really wants to go with his papacy?
Yeah, so I've already referred to it as when he names the next set of cardinals. And part of the reason this traditionally comes out at the end of the year, so usually in November, some kind of announcement, we'll have what's called a consistory where all of the newly named cardinals will go and get their red hats in St. Peter's Square, or St. Peter's Basilica. That normally happens in December. Francis, I love Argentinians, right? So the number of cardinals is capped at 120. There were 135 cardinals that could vote in the conclave at the point that Francis dies. And so I think Leo is letting that trickle down, and I think we'll wait until there's 110 cardinals or so, and I think we'll see a group of maybe 15 or 18, and I'll be curious on that list. And right, if I could just speculate a bit, I think you're going to see backfilling of those major archdioceses. They're finally going to have the new guy in New York, right? Like has got to be right on that list. But I think there are going to be some surprises. So yeah.
And